Welcome, welcome, welcome. So my name is Brad Reed, and I am a Deputy Director in the City Council's Legislative Division. I will be your MC for this panel. We will be hearing from all of my fine colleagues that you see seated here to my side. Today's agenda is in 4 parts. First, I'll give you a little bit of background on the City Council, who we are, what we do. After that, we will have 3 panels discussing new or improved data sets that you will soon be able to find on the Open Data portal. So the New York City Council, it's the local legislature for the city of New York. There are 51 council members, each individually elected, one of whom among them is elected as speaker. Our current speaker is Adrienne Adams. However, when I think about the City Council, that's personally not what I think about, right? What I think about is, well, the picture here, the people here, right? It's the staff, it's the people, it's the literally hundreds of people who make the City Council work. And we will do our best today to represent all of those people by sharing some of our work that we get to do. So in this picture here, this is actually a bunch of people we were getting together to think through and to work on some language access policy issues. And I love that picture, and it's actually, if you ever visit me at my office, that picture is right next to me. But that is the spirit, and that is the kind of work going on behind the scenes at the City Council. So this is also why today's panel is so special. We are pretty unique among legislatures, in that the legislative division of the City Council has a team of in-house data scientists and a team of in-house web developers. I don't know if there's any other legislature, state or local, anywhere in the country where that's the case. And if you know, you can tell me later, but for the purposes of this presentation, I still don't know. We bring together lawyers, analysts, data scientists, web developers together, and it creates something special. And I truly do brag. I was talking to people from Philadelphia, and I was like, oh, your legislature doesn't have that? No, it would be nice. You should look into it. And when I say we work together, I truly mean that. We literally work together. Our offices are mixed together. We're in some of the same meetings. And when we have policy questions, we work together to try and resolve them. So some of the people here on the stage with me, I'm going to tell you more about them as this program goes on. We have Al and Jonathan and Ahmad from Legislative Division. We have Frank and Yogi from Community Engagement Division. You will hear more about each of them in turn. But there's also some other people not on stage that I do want to make special mention of, particularly some of the leadership of our data and web teams. Rose Martinez, seated up front. Hey, Rose, woo! Melissa Nunez and Mandy Yu, also part of the leadership of our team. And in particular, I want to make special mention of Ann Driscoll. So Ann is the City Council's new Open Data Coordinator. Yeah, this is the right event where that gets a cheer. This presentation literally could not have happened without her. If you want to know her dedication, she's actually in South America right now, I presume watching this. Hey, Ann. She was up at 9 a.m. this morning going over our PowerPoint slides just to make sure, while she's on vacation, just to make sure that everything was in good shape. So while she couldn't be here today, I will still ask you to give her a round of applause. Thank you. So, when WNYC ended the broadcast of City Council meetings in 1940, there was a public outcry. It was considered for the past 2 years New York's most popular broadcast. Good news and bad news. Bad news is, not only are we no longer the most popular broadcast in New York City, spoilers, but you would have a hard time looking up any records of what the council was doing back in 1940. The good news is, you don't live in the 1940s. Thanks to Open Data, you will have access to as much, or at least so much more information on the activities of the City Council, more so than the people of the 1940s could ever dream of. They would be extremely jealous of you. You would have to explain to them what a website is and a computer, but then they would be extremely jealous of you. We are fortunate today where we can, well, let me just jump ahead here, where we can come and present these things to you. We're really excited. I'm going to talk a little bit about the powers of the City Council because that sort of explains the type of data that we have. So we are the legislative body of the city. We have several key powers. You can see some of them listed here. Obviously, we have the ability to pass local laws, authority over local legislation. But we also hold hearings. Those hearings could be on legislation. It could also be just oversight over city agencies and operations. We approve the city budget or approve modifications to the city budget. We appoint persons to various officers, such as the taxi commissioners, or we have advice and consent over certain officers, such as the corporation council. We also play a vital role in the land use process. Part of ULURP, if you're familiar with ULURP, but there's lots of other smaller land use roles we play, such as approving certain tax exemptions or sidewalk cafes. Also, not listed, not technically a power, but very much a thing that the City Council does, and something you'll hear more about in a little bit, is council members' offices provide services to their local constituents, helping them to resolve issues that they might have, problems they're having getting city government to assist them with something, or the tree on their block, or the pothole in their street, whatever it may be. That's something all the council members take very serious, and you'll hear more about that in a little bit. So we have all these powers. Do we use them for anything that you might care about? I hope so. You're here at least. Some of the things that we have done in the last year and a half, I won't read the whole list to you, but if you've ever considered renting an apartment, if you've ever considered jaywalking, if you've ever considered reading a free book or applying for a job, then we might have made your future life just a little bit better in the last year and a half. But perhaps of even more relevance to the people here today, back in 2012, we passed the open data law. Thank you, yes. Right, Local Law 11 of 2012. I believe we were the first, Noel or someone could correct me on this, but I believe we were the first to introduce that bill. However, San Francisco snuck in and passed one before us. Thank you, thank you.
New York City still #1.
Amen. I will say that the text, and to your point, the text of the New York City Open Data Law is so foundational that when I've been trolling through open data laws of other states, executive orders by various states, other cities' open data laws, I've found language from our open data law in their text, right? Yeah. So, since then, we've also passed about 9 subsequent local laws to add improvements to the open data law. Like anything else, you create a thing, you start it, you hope, you put it out in the world, and you find there's little things that could be a little bit better. So we've done things like require data dictionaries to help explain the data sets to people, or standardize geospatial information, or require more timely updates. The City Council can, of course, generate data. No, this was the slide I was planning to go to. Yeah. The City Council can, of course, generate its own data. As I mentioned before, very much the data that we generate is tied to the things that we do. It is tied to our powers, right? So the data we generate tends to be related to legislation, the holding of hearings, approving the city budget, assisting constituents, land use, much of which you will hear about as we go on here. So, why tell you about all this? Well, some of it is just as the slide says, we're here to present information. Some of it is historical record. Some of it is our prioritization of transparency, trying to give you the ability to dig deeper, look at what we're doing, give us your thoughts on what we're doing, good or bad. One of my colleagues can share his email address. You can send all complaints directly to Jonathan or something. But The fact of the matter is the City Council is uniquely proud of the open data law and invested in seeing its continued success. And that is very much what brings us here today and very much motivates us to try and even improve our own release of data. So that brings us to the first of the data sets that we will be discussing today. As I mentioned before, it'll be broken up into 3 panels. Each panel will have 2 people to present that panel. For this first one, I'll be kicking it off. As I said, I'm Deputy Director in the Infrastructure Division. I work on legislation, drafting, negotiating, researching legislation. Been at the council since 2009, on central staff since 2014. Some of you may have worked with me or come across me in the past. Either way, I have been there for a while, and I have worked on some of the open data issues in the past as well. After me will be Jonathan Shai, right over here to the left. Jonathan is an Assistant Deputy Director in the Legislative Division, where he has run our web development team for many years. He first joined us in 2018, all right, verified, as a web developer, where he organized a team to build an internal application suite known as IWAM, which is literally vital to the operations in the Legislative Division. It is something that I and my team use every single day. But it's only one of the many systems he's actually set up. He's set up a number of them, big and small. And on a personal level, aside from how much I actually do like him, I can't tell you how great it is to have the web developer building the systems that you will be using be just another colleague in your division, where you can literally walk down the hallway and chat with each other and learn from each other on how best to proceed and how best to develop the system. It truly means that everything our team builds is responsive to what the City Council needs. So we'll hear from him in a few moments. First, since we will be talking about Legistar, I will note that Legistar is a system where we can track some of the City Council's core legislative function, but it should not be confused with the Legistars. And the Legistars, you can see the logo to the left, that is the City Council's beloved softball team. You've got Lil Bill, our slugging piece of legislation up there. The key difference, there's an S at the end of the word, and that is how you can tell the two of them apart. And you can also see my camera shy photo. It's me in uniform making a catch. So if you go to our website, you go to the top, you click on legislation, that is the front-end expression of the Legistar system. There's also an API to access it. And historically, all the open data sets, the Legistar open data sets that we would put on the portal were manually pulled, which is annoying. And because it's annoying, it means it wasn't updated often. And so I would get comments from the public asking for updates, and they were 100% right, but it would take time and it would be difficult to try and give you the updates we wanted to give you. So we're working to improve that, part of what we'll be talking about today. All right, a little bit more about Legistar and therefore the legislative process. So what does Legistar track? Legistar tracks the public life cycle of bills, resolutions, hearings, appointments, messages from the mayor, budget adoptions, land use approvals, and more. On this slide, you can see an example of it for legislation. A bill first appears on Legistar when it is what we call introduced. That's when it's made public. This happens by a sponsor, one of the committee members, or the public advocate. Public advocate is a non-voting member of the City Council. At what we call a stated meeting. Stated meeting is when the entire City Council gets together for a meeting. At that meeting, it is assigned to a committee for consideration, and this is the starting point for most bills. It is also the end point for most bills. Well, someone either really agrees with that or is really unhappy. As just a math game, as a reality, most bills don't proceed further than this. The idea is put out in the world. You can discuss it. You can call your member, say, I love it, I hate it, whatever it is. The idea is out there. Most of them do not proceed to get a hearing. For those that do proceed to get a committee hearing, that would be the next step in the process. When there is a hearing, Legistar is used not only to calendar the hearing, but also as a central repository for hearing materials like the committee report, the testimony, the transcript, the attendance count, right? All the things that you might want to know about what happened. Also, if you go on our website, there's a link to the hearing video. For bills that have a hearing, many of them, perhaps most of them, don't proceed beyond that point. Maybe there was strong opposition. Maybe people came and testified and we learned something we did not know, right? At that hearing. That is the purpose of the hearing. And so some of those bills, after the hearing, we just reconsider it. We thought it was a good idea. We heard from the public. Turns out, not a great idea. We're not going to do it. So here, too, it's another possible endpoint for many bills. However, maybe the testimony was positive, or maybe we thought of great ways to amend the bill to make it work based on the testimony. And so there's some few bills that we decide to advance. And if we are advancing it, then we start working on what we call a proposed A version, or an amended version of the bill. Once we have a proposed A version, once we've gone through the process of talking to stakeholders about how we should change the bill, talking to the mayor's office, talking to the sponsor, proposed A version may be made public on Legistar. At that point, we are likely looking to advance that bill towards a vote. If so, we would have a committee vote, functionally a second hearing on that bill. At the committee vote, assuming it was approved, it would go back to the full council for their approval at another stated meeting. If they approve it, it's sent to the mayor. The mayor can sign the bill, in which case it's law. The mayor can do nothing, in which case it's law. Or the mayor can veto it, send it back to us, and we can override with a supermajority. As a practical matter, if you see a bill pass with a supermajority, there'd be little point in the mayor vetoing it, and so the mayor often will not. The entire life cycle of a bill, from start to finish, from introduction to everything that comes after, can be seen on Legistar. If you want to know what happened to a bill from a prior session, you can look and you can see how far along it got. What does Legistar not track? It does not track drafts and works in progress. If we're still in a deliberative process, if there isn't anything finalized, it's not up there. We may be talking to people, we may be hearing from people, but drafts and works in progress are not posted. Likewise, correspondence that we receive outside of the hearing process is not put on Legistar. People email, call, text, they hire trucks with billboards on the back to drive back and forth in front of our offices. All that is true. Anything to communicate their approval or disapproval of whatever it is we're considering doing, that is not on Legistar unless it occurred in the context of a hearing or was submitted for the purposes of a hearing. Also, the Legistars with an S, our one loss record is not available. On Legistar, statistically, we lost. So why does Legistar track things? What is the purpose of Legistar? It's a record of our activities. So drafts, work, oh, sorry, that one. It's a record of our activities. So publicly accessible record. It's to show our legislative intent. It's to make it available to you so you can see what we are doing, so you can see how things are going. Moreover, it is also something that is used by council staff. When I need to look up who is the sponsor of a bill, what committee was this bill assigned to, what happened to this bill in a prior session, I go to Legistar. In fact, most of the time I go to the same publicly available website because the information I need is there to me the same as it is to you, which quite frankly is how it should be. So before I pass to Jonathan, I'll note that I have a particular personal interest in making Legistar as robust and publicly accessible as possible, and that's because that's my work up there. I mentioned before, I work on legislation, right? I've drafted, I've negotiated literally hundreds of bills and local laws. When you were looking at bill text, it's totally possible I wrote that. And just like any other author, I want everything that I have written to be read by as many people as possible, and so I want it available to you. With that, I will pass to my colleague, Jonathan, to tell you more about the technical side of Legistar. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Hi, again, my name is Jonathan Chai. I'm the Deputy Director to the Web Development Unit here at the City Council. Let me just make sure I know how to work this. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Legistar. As a web developer, I get a sort of unique insight into websites and how we kind of use this data. I work with Legistar nearly every day, and I work with the API especially. So as Brad may have mentioned earlier, Legistar is kind of broken up into sort of two sides. We have the website side and we have the API side. And both have sort of their limitations in how you're able to use them. On the website side, I would say that the sort of biggest limitation is that there are not a lot of ways to filter through the criteria, all the different things that we can kind of filter these pieces of legislation by. You're also limited by the number of rows that you can see all at the same time, right? We have about 1,000 rows per page. And sometimes because the data is so spread out, it's very hard to kind of look at that and get a kind of worldview on, or like analyze the data. On the API side, we kind of see the same issues. Records are limited by 1,000 rows per call. The different tables are sort of spread out, so it kind of just feels like the data is siloed, and you often need to make several API calls in order to get the information that you're looking for. Right. The fact that there is no data dictionary is sometimes very stressful because you don't know exactly what the data is that you're looking at, right? As we kind of try to do that with open data, we give you a more sort of concise explanation as to what the individual columns are, and it helps you kind of get a broader look at that. Let's switch over to our next slide here. There we go. As to why Open Data Portal is going to be a lot easier to use than Legistar, I first and foremost want to say that it's not a replacement to the Legistar system. Legistar has all that raw data in there just waiting to be kind of used. What Open Data is really kind of doing for us is that it aggregates a lot of that data. It tells a story. There's a specific purpose to the data, right? I'm sorry, I was not fully prepared here. Yeah, so Open Data is just sort of like a great way to put that information together for you in a single spot instead of having to, say, reach across 2, 3, or 4 data tables in order to connect everything together. Earlier this month, I had someone from the public reach out to me and ask me, how were they able to filter through all of legislation and find ones where the mayor had sort of vetoed the bill. And at that point, I actually wasn't even sure how to do that myself. I had looked through the API. I had looked through the Legistar website. I had to actually talk to our sort of our team over at the City Council who manages the Legistar data to figure out how to get there. And it was only until I figured that out with them that I said I needed to go through 2 or 3 sort of endpoints in order to find that information. So being able to have all that data collected in a single place for you is monumental. And I would say that some of the things that are coming up, as we have it on the slide here, we have a lot more data sets to come. We have like sort of our council member information. We have actions, which are sort of what the council members can do on a piece of legislation, whether they vote for it, whether the mayor is vetoing it. There's a lot of different actions that can be taken on a piece of legislation. And it's going to be great to have all of that in one place in order for you to find. And just to give you kind of a preview of some of the data sets that are already there. So we have ones for the bills and local laws. As you can kind of see here, these are all of the columns that we are presenting on Open Data Portal. I can tell you, as a matter of fact, that this set of data probably took like 2 or 3 API calls to kind of aggregate the data together into a single data table. We also have one coming up, which is staged, not live yet, which is our resolutions. Again, these tables, these columns, they were across several different API calls in order to kind of grab together and display it for you. We have a lot of exciting things to do on Open Data, but I think I'm going to pass it back to our MC, Brad, here to give it over to someone else.
Thank you, Jonathan. So this is honestly my favorite part because this is where I just get to say nice things about my colleagues instead of having to talk about whatever it is I'm going to talk about. So for our next panel, You switch to the nice slide with your nice photos. I'm going to invite two of my colleagues to continue. First, Yogi. So Yogi Rosario Duran. Yogi is everything that's right with public service. And she's part of the council's community engagement division, where she's been managing and administering constituent service systems for the past 7 years. She had told me, because I was just talking to her before this, like, what would you want me to say? I kind of knew what I'd say, but what do you want me to say anyway, just in case? And she said she approaches technology project management from the perspective of trying to use technology to simplify work, to not be a burden. But I think it's important to note something. If you are doing project management for a company, for a mayor's office, for an agency, whatever, you have a central party, one person that you have to please, a mayor, a CEO, a commissioner. For the city council, if you're doing a product that is meant for 51 individually elected officials to all use and to try and get buy-in from people from the tip of Staten Island to the northern part of the Bronx, I mean, whew. That is not easy project management. Yogi makes it look easy. And so we'll be hearing from her in a minute where she talks about Council Connect. I will also say that she is my teammate and a member of the Legistars softball team, although these days she cheers more than she plays. We will also be hearing from Alat Moussaoui. Al is the council's chief data scientist, and he oversees both our data and our web teams. But more importantly, he, along with Rose Martinez and Jeff Baker, built those teams to what they are today. And John, okay, sorry. I was thinking of James also, but there wasn't years of history to turn to. We couldn't look to see how this was done in like the 1970s. There wasn't even a template for legislatures on how to incorporate both data science and web development into a legislative division. These are very different skill competencies. So they took a fledgling data science team of about 4 people and built it into a division of now, I believe, over 20 people between the two. And most importantly to me, he's also an outfielder on the softball team. We're running out of players up here, so you're not going to have to hear that a lot more. But with that, I will give the microphone to my teammates, Yogi and Al.
Thank you, Brad. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by providing some geographical data about the council. So going in line with what Brad was mentioning before. So there are 51 council districts, 3 in Staten Island, 8 in the Bronx, 10 in Manhattan, 14 in Queens, and 16 in Brooklyn. Constituent services is one of the most impactful services that a district office can provide to their local community. We look at the previous system that was used for constituent services. And after intensive research, data analysis, the provided data revealed the need for a new CRM, a better CRM, keeping in mind that the old system was implemented 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, actually. After working at the speed of government, that many of us know, we decided to build a new in-house database that put the people before the product. A system with accessibility, transparency, and open data as foundational goals. Bless you, whoever was sneezing. To ensure usage and longevity, we knew the system must be effective, engaging, and enjoyable. As a result of a cross-divisional collaboration, and we're talking about the web development team, the legislative team, the community engagement, IT department, and others, we can today present you, and also thanks to the speaker, Adrienne Adams, also for her support. Today we can present Council Connect, our brand new state-of-the-art CRM system designed exclusively for council members and their staff to track and handle cases, manage constituent detail, access resources such as the Green Book. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Green Book online. Anybody? Yes, thank you. And also, one of my favorite tools in the system, we have an address lookup tool where you can find the jurisdiction of a given address and intersection. Now, how does the council use this? So one of the biggest benefits of using Council Connect is that it helps to keep the collected data clean and organized, which is very important as when we are pushing this data then on the Open Data Portal, right? We're improving data accuracy and accessibility. Now let's keep in mind, all data entry is done by trained district staff. There, in the system, there is a constituent directory that is used for contact management, where the users can add, edit constituent's name, address, phone, email, even language preference. Under the directory, there is a group section where they can log the support or opposition towards a bill, an opinion, or they can also create a group list based on association or affiliations. To track issues, there is a caseware panel and a report section with a dashboard that convey action and interactivity. Council Connect can also be used to evaluate a district office performance and productivity, helping identify blind spots or areas of improvement. Now let's take a look at the data journey. And that will be an example. Oh, now I just realized I wasn't really talking to the mic, sorry. So let's take a look at the data journey. There's many ways the district office can help a constituent. We have here an example. The constituent is reaching out to a council member office. Anybody can give me an example of how to reach out to a council member office? Go ahead. Email. Another? Phone? Any other? Say that? At their office, yeah, walk in. Another? Yes, written email. And now we also have social media, text messages. Those are other ways. And very funny one, events. Because how many times I heard a council member is at the post office or at the supermarket and somebody's talking and all of a sudden a case is being shared or somebody's having some issue and then he goes back to the office. They go back to the office and enter the information. So yes, many ways. So that's the first step, is to reach out to the council member. So step 2, the district staff will initiate intake and data collection. They start by collecting the constituent's name, address, phone, and email, verify jurisdiction, gather all case details, such as what kind of type of issue is this? What are the relevant agencies? The urgency, in this case, no heat, no hot water. Hey, when it's like less than 20 degrees or 10 degrees or below, you want your heat and hot water. We also get reference numbers such as 311. Step 3, the case is entered in the system and a unique ID is assigned, and the case is filed under a specific issue and topic. And you're gonna find out more about that later. The case is assigned to appropriate staff. They reach to the relevant agencies or CBO, send letters, email, or make phone calls to advocate for the constituent, and track all responses and follow-ups inside Council Connect, inside the system. Constituent, step 5, is informed of their case progress. Step 6, resolution and closure. A case can be considered closed if no further action is needed. The staff informs the constituent of the resolution and the case is marked as closed. Data insights from cases can be used for policy recommendations or advocacy efforts. By leveraging this new state-of-the-art system, district office can deliver faster, more efficient, and data-driven services, ensuring that the constituents' voice is heard and their concerns addressed effectively. Council Connect is a reflection of the Council's commitment to transparency, digital inclusion, and open government principles. Now I'm going to pass it to Al Moussaoui, who was able to build this system. So I'm going to pass it to him so he can talk to you more about that.
Thank you, Yogi. So, yeah, my name is Alat Moussaoui. I also go by Al. Thank you for the introduction earlier, Brad. So I want to talk about how it was built, and I'm going to talk a little about the practical side, and then I'll talk a little bit about the technical side. So from the practical side, building a new system is not something that just comes out of thin air and is accepted out of nowhere. So the reality is that we had a little bit of experience in the past. So Brad mentioned that there was a system called IWAM, which manages the intake of ideas for legislation and their conversion, the whole process of making that idea into a bill. That was built, and it took a little while. It was a very slow process until it was finally accepted, turned on. We switched from the old system to the new system. People realized that, yeah, this actually works a lot better when we have the ability to build everything from scratch using open source technologies. We can actually customize it to the exact needs of our staff. So we had a proof of concept. The second step was a desire to move forward. So Yogi and I had many chats, and she expressed a desire for more functionality, and she expressed dissatisfaction with the former system. And so I heard some of these things from others in the council as well. And there were requests like, could you fix this former system to do X, Y, and Z? And sadly, the answer was no. It wasn't a system that we owned. It was some proprietary technology that we were just purchasing, essentially. And so we knew that, you know, if we want to do something better, we're just going to have to build it from scratch on our own. So that took a few conversations between Yogi and I and upper management to get the buy-in. But with the success of IWAM, it wasn't very difficult. So that's the practical side. So the reality of like the technical side, I guess a little more on the practical side. We had also hired a developer, maybe a year out of school. Her name is Mandy Yu. She's now the assistant deputy for the web development unit. And she was very much, she showed a lot of potential. And we actually put her, and we were planning to put another person on building this platform, but she just went crazy and did it all herself. And I really want to give a shout out to Mandy Yu, who should be doing Mandy Yu should be giving this presentation right now, but she was unable to make it, so I'm just standing in on her behalf. But this was really over 95% built by her. In under 1 year, I actually did not think she was going to be able to meet the deadlines. Neither did CED, the Community Engagement Division. It's not a comment on her. It's a comment on the difficulty of being able to build that whole website and successfully deploy it. So now we'll get a little bit into the technical. At the council, everything we build is from scratch using open source technologies. And the reason why we do that is because we can customize the technology that we build to the exact needs of whoever we're building it for, usually the council. That means they can ask us for X, Y, and Z, and if there exists technology to do it in the world, we can probably get it done. Unless the technology is very recent, we don't have access to it, it's still proprietary. But that's really where we want to be. We want to be able to offer the latest and the most capable technology to the council. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about the stack. Everything we do, a lot of what we do, everything runs on some Linux operating system, usually Ubuntu. We just run it ourselves. We might run it on a local server. We might get it from run on Amazon AWS. Nginx web server, Gunicorn, all open source stuff. Postgres backend, Django, front end, building it in TypeScript, React, Redux, Chakra. And that's really it. That's you just jump in and you figure out whether what you want to build is possible using the technologies at your disposal, and then you jump in and you speak with the stakeholders, understand what the requirements are, and you jump in and you do it. All right, so what about some of the data? So we already have a system and it provides a lot of data, and our new system is going to be providing very similar data, such as case number, borough, council, district, community board status, open date, close date. But additionally, we're going to be providing intake method and agencies. So intake method, Yogi discussed, email, walk-in, text message, social media. Topic was already provided, but now we're also going to provide, with a little more detail, the exact issue that the casework is dealing with. Since I work with the data team and web team, with the data team, I always want everything to have latitude, longitude. For privacy reasons, we could not provide that with this data, even though I would have loved that. But there is borough, council, district, and community board. So we try to give people a plethora of options for understanding the boundaries of the regions that the data is provided in. And with that, what could you do with the data? What you could do with the data is really up to you. You, as civil data scientists, civil workers with the data, can really take it, get creative, manipulate it in however manner you want. But generally speaking, you can understand what's going on in different districts, what issues are being reported, understand the process of how district offices are helping constituents, and allow for analysis on contact method to understand communication preferences and improve outreach methods just by analyzing all the data. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Brad.
Thank you, Al. So for our third and last of the panels on data sets, jump ahead to the relevant pictures where Frank is wearing a fighter plane as a hat. So first you'll be hearing from Frank Perez. Frank has been with the City Council since 2017 as part of the Community Engagement Division and has worked on various issue areas, most prominently among them education and participatory budgeting, which you will hear more about in a moment. And as you listen, though, I want you to keep something in mind. Council members and their staff have come and gone since the council started doing PB in 2011. Speakers with various priorities have come and gone. The secret to how participatory budgeting has not only continued, but grown and become refined in its process, despite all those transitions, is people like Frank, who provide the expertise and institutional knowledge that ensures the PB program continues. After Frank, we'll be hearing from Ahmad Zaki. Ahmad is a full stack developer in the legislative division, and he throws all of himself into every project that he takes on. When he built an interactive floor map for our division, he didn't just show the basics like people's names and where they sit. He had the map tell you how many footsteps away each person is from you, as well as how many calories you would burn by going to visit them, to encourage you to do so. In that same spirit, he has developed a new voting system for participatory budgeting, which is being implemented this year and which you'll hear more about in a moment. And one of the perks of being the person who builds the system is he took upon himself the honor of being voter number 1 and casting the first PB ballot for this year's voting. So with that, Frank.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you all. So I just want to start off with a very basic question, but who here has heard of participatory budgeting? Oh, everyone. Okay, perfect. So I trust that you all have a sense of what I'll be discussing, but in terms of the overall portion of this presentation, I think you'll be hearing some very exciting updates relating to what we're doing here at the council, and especially in terms of becoming self-sufficient, especially from start to end, which I'll get to in a moment. So just for those who don't know what PB is, participatory budgeting, the concept of that process, it's essentially a initiative process where community members decide how to spend a portion of a public budget. And the process began in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989. So the concept of that initiative did not start here in North America, but actually somewhere else in South America. So in terms of the council's process, which we refer to as PBNYC, it began in 2011 with 4 council members. At the time, they essentially conducted the process on their own through their own offices. However, over the years, the process has grown to include half of all city council members and is now administered centrally from my division. So since 2011, we've had over $100 million in capital funds funded through the process. Not to be confused as separate funds, just funds that through this initiative have been funded and adopted into the city budget. And this year, it includes 25 council members across New York City. So if you do know what PB is, you likely know if your council member is participating or not. But we will discuss the data journey, which essentially is how an idea becomes a proposal and eventually a funded project. So the data journey, a constituent, Benji Benchmore, his nickname is Buttons, submits their idea for new tree guards to the idea map. And I'll get to the idea map in the next slide. But following that submission of the idea, district staff and budget delegates, who are essentially the core foundations of the process, sort through their idea and turn them into project proposals, scoping cost and feasibility in accordance with the respective city agency. So something along the lines of new tree guards, that would be within the Department of Parks and Recreation. And then following that, the district committee, when it's closer to the voting period, would narrow down proposal and include an idea such as this one on the ballot. The final step of the process, as many of you know, is voting period. And through this process, there is a 9-day voting period, which actually begins today. Not to spoil it for anyone, but if the project does become successful, council members fund that project, which are then adopted into the city budget and implemented on behalf of the agency. So how can you take part as a crowd of individuals that know what this process is? The very first step is to submit an idea. And while I won't go into the specifics, I'm very excited to present to you all with our internal online idea map, which was developed this year by Ahmad. And essentially, this is an open interactive map where anyone in a participating district, even if you don't live in a participating district, can submit an idea to improve your community, improve your neighborhood. And so this is available through our website, ideas.pbnyc.org. And then the next step, which is also very, very exciting, is the voting platform. And this is the step where if you live in a participating district, you can vote for your favorite projects. You can then have a say directly in the projects that may or may not get funded by the council members. So This is a preview of what it looks like if you were to vote on desktop. You can either identify your council member, search by address, and then be taken directly to your ballot to select your favorite projects. This is essentially, as I've mentioned before, something that we have historically had a vendor for both the idea map and the voting platform. This year, we decided to bring everything in-house, and in doing so, we started making the process self-sufficient from start to finish. And so the last plug I'll make here today is that Vote Week starts today. So beginning today, Saturday, March 29th to Sunday, April 6th, that's 9 full days. You can vote online or in person. In person, you can vote directly in your council member's district office. I'll note that to vote online, Chrome is best, and of course, desktop, laptop is also ideal. So that website is vote.pbnyc.org. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ahmad, who will discuss the back end of those two tools that I have shown here, the voting platform and the idea map, and just discuss how he was able to create this from his end.
Thank you, Frank, for the walkthrough. You made my job a lot easier. And thank you, Brad, for the introduction. So in the past years, we have only released data sets for funded projects. But this year, we are excited to introduce a much richer data set, one that includes every idea submitted by the public, not just the ones that made it to a vote or got funded. This is a major shift toward transparency in the early stages of the participatory process. So we have also added more structured fields like category, location, description, and council district, along with fields like votes, cost, and address for submissions that became formal proposals. This makes the data even more useful for analysis and storytelling. We're also planning to release survey data submitted anonymously by voters to help us understand who is participating. That survey is separate from the vote itself, but it adds valuable demographic and experiential context to the broader participatory budgeting process. So, how was it built? So to support all of this, we built a fully custom platform designed specifically for the needs of the participatory budgeting team. On the back end, we used Django with PostgreSQL, hosted on an Ubuntu server and served via Nginx and GUnicorn for performance and scalability. The idea map front end was built using HTML, Leaflet.js library, which is a really cool library for rendering maps if you guys are interested in, and custom JavaScript that lets users drop pins on a map, submit ideas, and explore submissions in real time. We also developed an online voting front end using Vite and Chakra UI, optimized for accessibility and speed. The platform supports both digital and physical ballots. So for the in-person ballots, we built a Python image processing pipeline that uses OpenCV library to scan and interpret paper votes and feed that data into the same backend. The whole system was developed in about a year and was custom built to meet both the user experience goals and the data collection requirements for PB. So next slide. So what could you do with the data? With the new platform and the expanded data release, there's so much more we and you guys can explore. You'll be able to analyze the full spectrum of community input, not just what made the ballot, but everything that was submitted. You can look at spatial patterns, for example, where ideas are coming from versus where funding is going. You could explore what kinds of projects tends to win or not based on cost, category, and location. Or apply text analysis to the descriptions to identify emerging themes, patterns, or priorities across districts. Participatory budgeting is already something residents can take part in if their district optimized in. But with this new platform, we are making it easier to participate, easier to see what others cares about, and easier for data folks like you to dig deeper into what our communities are asking for. Thank you so much. I'll pass it over to Brad.
Thank you, everyone. So I had a really touching, poignant, and heartwarming closing that I'm not going to read because we're running low on time. But you've just imagined you were amazed, and that was what that was. But with that in mind, everyone that you heard from today on this panel is dedicated to improving the lives of New Yorkers. And we see the open data law's continued success as part of the city's success. And we will continue to support it, both through legislation, through oversight, and through improving the releases of our own data. I want to give a big thank you to Beta NYC for allowing us this time. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming and for hearing us out. Do we have time for like 1 or 2 questions? We have 4 minutes. All right, if there are questions, sir?
Could you use the mic, please?
Is this working? Yes. All right. Okay. Y'all seem to be moving a lot of stuff in-house, which is exciting and interesting. You're building a bunch of capacity to do it. I would love to hear a little bit individually from folks across different disciplines, like what's been good and bad about that and what you think about it.
Yeah, sure. What's been good? I can focus on what's been good. So this is actually a decision we took. This is because of us, because we, as a team, want to continue to grow and learn. When you build things from scratch and you build it yourself, you learn everything. You understand how the full system, or as I'm sure you know, Vikram, you gave a presentation to us on some of the great work you do. And that's number one. We build it ourselves. Number two, we learn a lot during the process. Number two, we can customize it to the exact needs of the council. Number three, there's a lot of cost savings associated with building it yourself. The negatives, if we're going to be honest about it, are that the New York City Council has to maintain a crew of talented individuals to maintain that technology. So that introduces a little bit of corporate risk, so to speak. And it also then saps from our time because we're doing everything, almost everything from scratch. Like one of the very few things we don't do from scratch is like text verification, for example. We use Twilio for, we're not going to build text verification. And so it takes a lot of our time, but I think we're here dedicated to that purpose, and the cost savings that we bring from building it from scratch justify. But really, on a personal note, we build the skills internally. We can offer new customized things that vendors likely would not be able to get into the nitty-gritty of. So, for example, IWAM, the platform that I'll keep it short. They've tried before us to build certain things, and they were unable to contract that work out and get it done right, but we were able to build it to the custom needs of the council.
A 30-second question? Yes.
I just have a question in terms of the Council Connect and anything with the legislation, in terms of like bills that are similar to other bills that failed, or in terms of like the heating aspect with landlords, like say there's a structural problem. Do you guys have that aspect, or is that something that you sort of push to sort of different agencies where you're like, this seems to be a different sort of thing that's happening to different people based on a landlord, a Con Ed issue, anything like that, if that makes sense?
Very quickly, we are working. I mean, this is one of the benefits of that we build Council Connect, is to help us to do better with that. Right now, it's only accessible to district staff. Maybe if we are exploring the options where this can maybe be accessible to a wider team within the council, and we hope that once we release the data set, that will be able to promote more of these conversations. But yeah, that's why, like towards the end, I mentioned the possibilities for advocacy efforts. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.